as the oh, lovely, good. Interesting times that is, meaning that I know the Chinese would have it that way, and meaning that we're faced with a fair number of pressing issues from this rampant epidemic, and the related political crisis, to the climate crisis, the refugee crisis, inflation on the rise, you name it. And yet tonight we've decided to talk about parenthood, as you know, of all the subjects. And I guess in more than 10 years of public debates at this department, this is probably the closest we've come to the slogan, "The personal is political." And I would imagine that many of you have some strong feelings and strong convictions regarding tonight's resolution. I know you all know what tonight's resolution or debate motion is, but here it is nevertheless. This House regrets the glorification of parenthood. Now, before our debaters dive into it, let me introduce them to you. We've got two teams, as always, teams of 3 people, team proposition, team opposition. And on proposition, Nika is the first speaker. She's waving, over there. Nika will be, she's Prime Minister tonight, and she's your fellow student of English and sociology as well. She was with us last year as well, so few people, older students will probably remember her. So welcome back, Nika, of course. And her fellow debater, the next in line is Taya. Hello, Taya. She comes from the Faculty of Social Sciences, and she's with us for the first time this year. She's not a novice debater, though, an experienced debater, but just our guest for the first time. The last speaker on side proposition is Yerneia. She's a student of law. Over there, you see a kindly face with glasses hidden now from you. That's side proposition. Side opposition, the first speaker, the leader of opposition, Mai, you can see him. He is a first year student of philosophy, right, from our faculty, also with us for the first time, but not a novice debater by any standards. The next in line, Ivan, that's probably the most familiar face, especially to older students. He's been with us for a number of years now. I've always introduced him as the student of social sciences, but tonight I need to introduce him as the National Debate Coordinator. So he's been promoted, And the last speaker tonight, the last debater, the opposition whip, Isa over there, another student of social sciences. Also, I would imagine a rather familiar face. You've been with us on 2 or 3 occasions before, right? And she enjoys being the last speaker, if I remember correctly. So we are in for a treat. They are a rather merry lot. They, tease one another a lot. They laugh a lot. They sometimes curse. They misbehave. I hope none of that happens, or just maybe a little something. Oops. Okay. A bit of an accident here, but everything is all right. Good. So these are the 2 teams. Also, all right, we need to admit a few more people. Fine. Okay. Yeah, they're coming in. So also with us is Nusha. You know her as well, our indispensable Nusha. You're another fellow student. Not in a few days, few weeks, very shortly, she's going to take her master's. But today, and we are all rejoicing in that, but today she's assuming the role of Madam Speaker. So she's the one who is in charge of everything. She makes sure that things run smoothly. Before we start, she will kindly and briefly explain the debate format to you. And at the end, after Isa's speech, she will be in charge. She will moderate the Q&A session. So yes, prepare your questions, your comments, your responses of any kind. More than welcome. We would like you to share with us, and we're always curious about, your second thoughts, your responses of any kind. Anyway, whatever your position on the motion, I hope that you'll find the debate encouraging or challenging actually enough and entertaining enough to also question your position, to doubt it, to change it, to upgrade it, to strengthen it, to do whatever as you see fit. And now, without further ado, I wish you all a very pleasant evening, and over to you, Nusha.
Okay, welcome everyone from my end. I will be a Madam Speaker today, which means that I will be introducing each speaker who will represent their side. But first, I will explain just briefly what debate actually is and what you can expect to see today. So today we will have two teams, so team government and team opposition, fighting on the topic of "This House regrets the glorification of parenthood." We have three speakers on each side, and they will go present their speeches interchangeably. So first we will have the first speaker of government, and then the first speaker of the team opposition, and vice versa. During their speeches, which should last about 7 minutes, the other team is allowed to ask questions. So don't be surprised if you sometimes see an unfamiliar face popping up or an unfamiliar sound popping up. This will be the other team asking questions, okay? The speaker is not obliged to take the question. So sometimes you might see that the debaters will simply wave them off, okay? So again, don't be surprised by anything that happens today. Everything should be generally normal. Should is the operating verb here. Now, during the debate, you are also invited to come up with the questions, as Professor Jelicic already said. I would greatly appreciate it if you could send the questions in advance. You can use the chat function for that, and you can message me, preferably me, or any of the other debaters, co-hosts. Generally, I would advise messaging me. If you message any one of the others, they might tell me, but if they don't like your question, they might not. So if you want to be listened to, ask me. If you find today interesting, if you think that debate is something that might be of interest to you as a speaker, all of us here are members of University of Ljubljana Debate Society, and we have regular meetings where we practice the art of argumentation and other skills. So you are kindly invited to join us every Wednesday at 6 p.m. At Kongressni Trg, at the building of the university. If you need more information, you can find us on Facebook or general social media. I think that's about it from my end. Just one very important disclaimer, since this topic is quite personal and debaters might find it important for me to say this. In debate, the sides that the debaters are arguing for are randomly assigned, which means that the opinions the debaters will tell you today, the arguments do not necessarily represent their personal opinions, okay? So in the discussion after the debate, you are more than kindly invited to attack the arguments, but please refrain from personal attacks on the debaters. This has happened before, and debaters are people too. Treat them kindly. Okay, so no questions in our chat, so I assume there's no questions, and I would kindly invite Nika to open up the debate as the Prime Minister. Here.
Okay, thank you, Nusha. Now, before I start, I am suffering from a bit of a cold, so I hope that my voice bears with me throughout the speech. Okay, so I will start in 3, 2, 1. Sometimes impossible standards don't motivate, but rather traumatize. This is why this house regrets the glorification of parenthood. We define glorification in this case as this narrative that's been established throughout the past decades that paints parenthood as much more rainbows and sunshine than it really is, right? And we believe that this prevailing narrative creates this idea of what a parent is supposed to be like to be a suitable parent. So this super parent that puts their needs and puts the needs and the wants of the child first before their own needs and wants, right? What does a day in the life of a super parent look like, right? First, they get up right before everybody else. They make breakfast for everybody else. They wake everybody up, possibly with a song from a Disney movie, I don't know. Then they chat over breakfast, right? They get their school bags ready. They take him to school. Then they clean and wash and iron the clothes during that time when the children are at school. And then after that, they bring them home and they make lunch and they eat lunch together and ask them about their day. And then they take them out and drive them to 20 different extracurricular activities, including music school and sports and everything else. And then they get back home and they help with the homework, and then they talk over dinner, and then they tug him into bed and tell them a good night story, and then they go to sleep exhausted. There's just no place to be a person besides a parent in this narrative of a super parent, and we believe that this is highly problematic for several different reasons. No, not yet. So we have at least two different stances on the side of proposition here, right? The first one is that this narrative encourages people to decide for parenthood when they otherwise might not have, right? So they have children when they otherwise might not have children. But secondly, it definitely changes their parenting style. And our second stance here that's really important is also that this influences women more, right? It hurts the women in the society more, but we admit that this is partially due to some other narratives that already exist in the society that make it harder to be a mother than to be a father necessarily. So in my speech, I will go through our first two arguments, the first one being creating bad parents, the second one creating non-functionable children. And then in our second speech, we will talk about minorities and how this influences them. But before that, I can take your POI, Ivan. Go ahead.
So, did you enjoy the fact, and do you think it was good for you that your parents supported you and drove you to debate club in high school, and help you, get to where you are now with debate or not?
Okay, my parents didn't drive me anywhere. The debate club happened in high school, and I was mostly left on my own to get to there and then to get home. And I think that was beneficial for me and for the parents as well, right? But I do admit that, yes, the glorification of parenthood influenced them as well. But we will talk about the most extreme cases in this scenario, because we believe that those are the most impactful. So, right, the parents and the children who take this glorification to heart the most, right? So going on to our first argument, and that is creating bad parents. So what we see here is that glorification necessarily means that this picture, this image of a parent is unrealistic, right? And that means that once a person becomes a parent, they are necessarily faced with this incongruency of what they should be and what they are physically capable of being, right? And that means that they usually take on one of the two possible responses we recognize. The first one we think is less common, but happens. And that is just giving up, realizing that you're never going to be good enough, and then just accepting that you're going to be quote unquote a bad parent. This is a trend that's happening recently in pop culture as well, where parents are seeking confirmation that this is okay. And movies such as Bad Moms are being made, where they kind of give allowances to women for drinking at 11 a.m. so that they would feel okay with not being great moms, right? So what we see here is this performative rebellion against this unrealistic standard of being a parent that causes at least two problems later on. First of all, those parents are compensating, right, for the disappointment of not performing up to the standard. But secondly, we have children who have objectively worse lives because of parents simply giving up and not even doing half of the job that they should, right? But what happens on the other hand, right, in this second scenario, is parents who keep trying, right? And that means that they try to do the best that they can constantly and then worry over not being enough. And that includes, for example, tiger moms, which are generally like acknowledged specimen today, with mothers who are too invested in their children's lives, right? And who give up everything in their own personal lives to fit the needs and the wants of children, right? That means giving up their careers, their aspirations, their friendships, their hobbies, all of their social lives. No, thank you. I don't have the time. And that necessarily means that those parents are like giving up being a person and then living through their children. And we will focus on why this is problematic for the children as well, but this is highly problematic for the parents because they should live their own lives and they can never be fully happy just living through somebody else. Now, going on to our second argument, that is creating non-functionable children. We believe that here there are two groups as well, right, that generally happen in this case scenario, right? On one hand, you get the overly critical children, right? Those are the children that internalize all of this like investment that their parents put into them, and now they feel like the output should match that investment, and it can never do that. If you don't want to be the exact copy of your parent, you can never fulfill all of the expectations that the parent has for you if they try to live through you, right, and realize themselves through you. That means that they simply cannot live up to the expectations, and they feel like they do not deserve the love of the parent or the love of themselves if they internalize it enough. So that simply means trauma and a lot of it, right? But secondly, we have this second group, right, where children become spoiled and self-centered because throughout childhood, they get all of the attention. They seem to be the center of the universe, right? So when they're adults, they cannot be faced with the fact that they're not in a society, right? That means that they expect the same, and they are unable to accept constructive criticism when it happens, and they basically become narcissists because of it. So they become a burden to themselves and a burden to the society. We believe that comparatively, this goes as an opposition to a world where simply a lot of people who are not fit to be parents yet don't decide to be parents, or secondly, even if they do decide to be parents, this bond and this relationship between a parent and a child is unburdened by these unrealistic expectations that just screw everybody over. So this is why we believe that on the side of proposition, we are in the right when we claim that the glorification of the parenthood is simply causing way more harm than good, and you should vote for our side. Thank you.
Thank you, Nika, for your speech. I now invite the leader of opposition to present their case. Thank you.
Am I audible? Also, ako POI в чату, в смысле just say POI, because like I really am not good with the random sounds coming from it. Yeah, cool. Thank you. Yeah, my voice isn't also doing that well. Sorry about that. A couple of things from my speech. Firstly, let's talk about these impossible standards that governments is supposed to say. Now, let's actually dissect them. Are they actually impossible standards, and are parents actually pressured into the situations the government wants to say? We say probably not, because it's a non-nuanced understanding of how just in general narratives work, right? Usually their narratives impact you not any specific, like to have a completely different standard than it actually is realistic. People are in fact like smart, and they can understand that narratives do impact different individuals differently. That is to say, if I am someone that has to work 2 jobs, I understand of being like the standard of being a good parent is not necessarily that I also like don't work and I actually help my children even outside of my work, let go of my entire life. I probably understand that I can do my best, and I probably just want to do that. The glorification of parenting is more nuanced in the fact that people understand that you can be a good parent in other ways, and we see that happening from every single day of our lives. We see that happening at a point in which individuals like value parents that are like working parents, that also like we value stay-at-home moms, we value also moms that are single parents, we value their contribution to society, and we glorify them as well. And the point in which this is true, recognize how a lot of their argumentation false, right? Because people in fact don't like this incongruency at the point at which they show you like the incongruency happens between what your expectations are and what is actually reality, probably false. At the point at which individuals do understand that narratives actually function in a different way, and simultaneously narratives themselves do function in different ways, because otherwise they don't created for general societies. They value the existence of parenting the most that you can do for your child specifically. But let's look at other argumentations that they bring to you. They bring to you the idea of tiger moms. And panel, I would argue that the reason why tiger moms exist is not because we glorify parenting. Perhaps there's more tiger moms like slightly more tiger moms because of that. But I would argue that the reason why tiger moms exist in the first place is because they're just generally unhappy with their current life and are projecting them to their children. This is clearly not because of the actual narrative, but probably because of some other like issues that already happened before this glorification happened in the first place. Lastly, they talk about how this idea, how children are going to be hurt in the process, how like they cannot match the outcome. Recognize how this is contingent on the idea that tiger parenting happens more on our side to a statistic degree, but they talk about it more about self-centeredness, and I will argue that throughout my argumentation. Before moving on to argumentation, one clarification that is hugely important that government did not point out. That is to say, when does this glorification happen and what does it mean to regret this specific glorification? What we say is that this glorification happened not like throughout this entire history, but rather in the past century, the point at which like the idea of a parent became more of an idea of like what is labor and what just in general is valued in our society for like 60s, 70s. Why is this important? This is important because like the comparative is not like the parents are just going to have a completely realistic expectations, but rather a more passive role in our society, as it used to be the case in the 1940s, 1950s, things like that. And the point at which this narrative exists, parents are more involved, and this is the comparative that we're talking about. Now, that being said, let's talk about our first two arguments. Firstly, I'll talk about how parents are better by the point at which they're glorified, directly clashing with both of their arguments in first speech. And second argument, I'll talk about how it's just better for women on our side of the house. Let's start with the first argument. Before that, I will take a POI.
Please do realize that the majority of the people are simply not educated enough or smart enough to realize the narrative exists. Ergo, the narrative is likely to affect them. Ergo, they're very likely to be pressured by the idea of a perfect parent and be pressured into being a bad parent ultimately because they're failing out of this ideal of what a good parent is.
Two responses. One, I think this is generally not a valid understanding of what working class individuals are. I'm pretty sure they are capable of understanding how narratives work, and I'm pretty sure they're not forcing themselves to overwork themselves to such a degree. But second, recognize that there's a second layer of my analysis, which was said that this is not how the narrative actually works in the first place. That is to say, we as a society, the narrative, even if you don't understand that it is a narrative and that you can be critical towards the narrative itself is saying that individuals can be good parents even if they're also like, do you have 2 jobs or 3 jobs? Because you're a hardworking parent and simultaneously a hardworking individual in our society. This is the nuance that we've missed. This is the reason why they failed this debate. First argument about how parents are better on our side of the house. Panel, I want to make something extremely clear, something the government already agrees with. That is to say, it is hard to be a parent. That is to say, at the point at which you wake up in the middle of the night since your baby is crying, at the point at which you're unable to understand your child because of the generational gap between you and the other, the point at which all of this is true, hard to be a parent, very bad. At the point at which this is true, there's a lot of like bad things that can happen to you, and individuals don't like being parents, which is bad. Why is this bad? Because at the point at which you're not likely to be parents, you're more likely to be passive and have a passive role in just society in actual parenting, which we can see happening in like the past century, at the point at which like a lot of like parents in the past were much more passive on a passive one and comparative. Why is this bad? Because the children were neglected, they were unable, like their needs weren't catered, they weren't like monitored, they weren't parents to the correct degree. This is extremely bad. The second thing that can possibly happen is at the point at which people are in fact pressured due to animal capitalism or other competing narratives to actually be involved in a child's life, and simultaneously they're not glorified for it. That is to say, they don't have like the societal gratification, the point at which individuals don't value their contribution to society. This can also be impacts are the same exact impacts as proposition could have. The point at which children do feel like they're neglected, at the point at which they are like felt like resented, just bad relations with parent-child. This is bad. This is the main reason why mental illness has happened in modern day society. Second argument about how feminism is good and happens on this side of the house. Panel, recognize that the only way that we can recognize labor is to glorify it. And the current situation was, like the past situation was, that we didn't glorify specifically women's work at the point at which like it was seen as something that was just like given, that women just had to do it in our in this current society. Now, at the point at which we started glorifying this work in itself, that is to say, parenting, it is more likely that individuals like value this work. What does this mean? This means that the women were more likely to be treated as individuals that actually contributed to society. 1. 2, there were individuals like that actually cared about parenting. That is to say, maternity leave was more likely to happen since individuals did understand that this is a part of work and you can't do it simultaneously with other things. Simultaneously, more individuals were more likely to actually partake into parenting. And that is to say, the male counterparts were more likely to come like into play because they actually understood that this is an actual value towards the job. So what we essentially say is that the comparative in our society here is 1, that the role the world without glorification, a world which you regret and recognize as a regret motion means that you are more passive. And two, a world in which you don't have glorification, the labor that women have done is not recognized, and thus individuals are unlikely to actually get any sort of justice. For these reasons, go opposition.
Okay, Mai, thank you very much for your excellent speech. Now I invite the Deputy Prime Minister to present their case.
Just a second. For POIs, please type POI in the chat, because I also don't like audible things from my computer during my speech. Yeah. So I will start in 3, 2, 1. 3 things in my speech. First is some rebuttal about the own arguments, then negation of the arguments of the opposition, and then lastly, our own less constructive on the side of proposition. First is some rebuttal about the narrative and so on, how narratives actually work. Please panel recognize the fact that narratives represented by the opposition are rarely work the way they propose. They said that narratives exist to the point where everyone is appreciated no matter what they do. But we have to realize that certain people are due to that narrative are gratified more, and certain people are gratified less. Parents that will try to do more things, parents that will do more for their child will be obviously gratified more. This does mean this is just a logical conclusion that everyone, I truly believe, can come to, and they cannot say, well, people in working class understand this narrative. No, because they still compare themselves to the parents that do everything for their child, to the parent that can they can take their children to a certain lesson, to a parent that can take their child to a debate club, to a parent that can take their child to a pianist, and so on. So they will still compare, and they will still feel inept compared to those parents. Therefore, the presentation narrative the opposition has put here does not really stand in the status quo. So now about our first argument, how tiger moms exist and do not exist because of glorification, but rather because of their own personal problems. First of all, I truly believe this. Even if this does stand true, we still truly believe that glorification of parenthood actually is the thing that actually makes these enables these things to actually happen. Why? Because now they are glorified. They're glorified for being these moms. They're glorified for overworking themselves and doing these things for their children. And now, so therefore, they will not feel bad for doing that. So they will not feel bad for hurting their child in the process of doing so. When these moms are excused for their behavior, we truly believe that glorification of parenthood is bad, because they are seen as saints. They are seen as someone better than everyone else, because they are moms, because they are sacrificing themselves for their child. Not direct negation of their 2 arguments. First of all, whether parents better they are glorified or not. Here they had 2 impacts. First impact was that your children were neglected in the past, and now they aren't anymore. Fun fact: children aren't neglected right now, not because of the glorification, but because we have established a certain mechanisms of how working works. Because in the previous times, people had to work all the time. Children were only seen as some sort of working hands to get more potatoes and so on. Therefore, the reason why their children are neglected anymore isn't because of glorification, but rather because we have established working time, and parents can take the leave, and parents can have certain they can come home at 3 p.m. and talk with their children and so on. They aren't as overworked anymore because some things such as worker rights exist, and so on and so on. Now about how this gratification actually helped these parents. We truly not believe that the gratification actually helped these parents so much. No, thank you. Why? Because at a certain point, people still recognize what good parents and what bad parents are on either side of the house. Because at a certain point, when a parent is trying for their child, people see, oh, this is good, they're trying for the child, without necessarily glorifying them and painting them as a certain saint and actually excusing their behavior because they're a parent. Second, about the feminism, about the glorification of labor and so on, and how women are now seen as people that are actually working and so on. First of all, we shouldn't believe that this is true. Why? Because of the glorification in the status quo currently looks at that when you have a child, your child is enough for you to survive. Your child is a gift, and you're a saint for taking care of the child. Therefore, all these things that you're doing, the fact that you're selfless, the fact that you're sacrificing everything for a child, is seen as something good. It's something you should be. It's something that you're praised for, and therefore, and being a parent is enough for you to live a certain fulfilling life because you are doing this God's work, because you're doing something so important. Second, about the male counterpart counterparts and they are no more likely to participate. Yeah, we truly believe in status quo, they still will not do the same work as women, because parents, because male counterparts, we usually the ones that will take like things such as fun work, for example, going on a walk with their child, or like reading bedtime stories to them, which is not the same to the labor that women contribute to when raising a child. Therefore, these male counterparts will still be the ones that will also be praised for doing their parenthood without actually doing the biggest parts of it. And not are less constructive about how this directly ties to discrimination marginalized groups. Two things to recognize here. First is that through the argument, we have to be realistic that in the current status quo, this glorification is to have it, people believing that having a child makes someone automatically a better person, creating a family is something everybody should strive for. And secondly, we cannot separate this glorification from common cultural norms that are directly tied to societal perception of parenthood. So something like, for example, like picture perfect family, being a heterosexual couple, and being a parent, a role that's more commonly expected from women. So three things in this speech: first about harm on the LGBT community, second about how this stigmatizes abortion, and thirdly about how this burst places a burden on women. But before I continue, I will take a POI.
Thea, don't you think that the fact that we have a special name for tiger moms signifies that this is not the standard you're talking about, that they are a deviation, and that they don't have anything to do with the concept of glorifying parenthood as it is?
Okay, but in society of adult persons, these tiger moms will still be excused for their behavior because they're doing this in the name of their children, because they're sacrificing their things, their time for the sake of their children. Therefore, because they're sacrificing themselves, because they're glorified and they have children, they will be excused for it. This doesn't mean that people they don't recognize them as possibly bad. So now to my arguments. First of all, how being a parent is about a privilege that's not accessible for a big majority of the LGBT community. Why? Because it's makes it even illegal, and second, because adoption is inaccessible because of it's expensive, or even in the LGBT couples are usually less likely to be chosen by adoption agencies because they are married, because of homophobia in our society. So how does glorification directly harm members of the LGBT community? First, they are excluded from societal norm that is celebrated, that being parenthood, and they are seen as a lesser member of society because they cannot fulfill this norm, which further differentiates from the norm. They make them seen as something else. Now, glorification also makes it harder for them to even have children. Why? Because parenthood, which is inherently tied to perception of family, is on such a high pedestal that it's self-celebrated, it's personal for many people, and glorification escalates that because it gives parenthood a bigger sense of importance. So now you already have a societal norm plus glorification that makes it more powerful. So therefore, you have to challenge it in order to become a same-sex parent. So changing this idea of family can be seen as harmful as attacking an already established one. So in an anesthetic society where family is already a political topic, it's only further harms chances of legalizing adoption by same-sex couples, at least further stigmatize them. Second was stigmatization of abortion. Glorification of parenthood not only celebrates the parent but the child as well. So when abortion goes directly against this notion, since it was most times a voluntary decision to give up a child that was already in parentheses on its way, parenthood is usually painted as a selfish act. So the glorification of parenthood here negatively portrays not only people that have children in the first place, but also people that choose abortion. So please, if you truly believe in the best for our children and the best for marginal groups, vote today's proposition. Thank you.
Thank you, Taya, for your speech. And now I invite Ivan to take over.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. So I'm going to do three main things in my speech. First of all, there's one important, I think, meta debate topic that we need to cover. Secondly, I'll go through the points that we've heard from side propositions so far and tell you exactly why they're not really as relevant or perhaps not even true. And lastly, I'll look at our third point of analysis, which talks about the demographics and the impacts that the glorification of parenthood has on those. The first point that I want to cover, which is this idea of this like meta debate. By the way, Nusha, timing me, I forgot to start my timer. Okay, thank you. The first point I want to make clear is that, there's not a single social mechanism that does not have some negative effects. Okay, we're not going to stand here and say there's absolutely nothing that's ever bad about the glorification of parenthood. But what side proposition is ignoring is the world without the glorification of parenthood. Right? What happens if we don't have it, right? And we hear a lot about, some extreme examples, the worst kinds of parents and how they're encouraged with the glorification of parenthood. And you know what? Maybe they are. But the alternative of not having the glorification of parenthood there. The alternative of people, as Mike clearly explained, the alternative people having no incentive to be parents is really problematic. And side proposition needs to come up and tackle this question. They need to ask and answer why they think that a world without the glorification of parenthood is a better world. Not just that there are issues in society, right? Because we agree. And there are issues with the glorification of parenthood. We agree. But the question today is the world without it a better place? And from our side, that's a resounding no. So if we look at what we hear from side proposition, we first get this idea that, oh my God, glorification of parenthood creates this, rainbows and sunshine approach to parenthood, right? Where parents are pressured into caring for their kids. Oh my God, horrible, right? How dare they, right? I mean, yes, okay, it does create some social pressure, but, social pressure into not murdering people is good, right? Just social pressure in itself is not a negative thing. You need to show us that pressuring people into that it's a bad thing. No, thank you, Naya. It's a bad thing. We're trying to pressure people that, you need to make this connection. And telling me people people are being pressured into taking their children to musical schools. Horrible, right? And we think, again, this is the point I made at the beginning. Okay, we agree there's some bad things in it, right? I guess there are people who, this create significant psychological issues, etc. first. And we should try to fix this. We should try to care for them, all of that. But in the vast majority of the cases, this creates a good and beneficial social mechanism, right? Children are better off in a world where parenting is seen as something good. Okay. So we need an explanation of this, right? And we haven't gotten it so far from side proposition. And so we have a clear, from our side, a clear incentive, a clear benefit for the children. While the negative effects that are presented on the parents, to me, are not as clear as side proposition is trying to propose them, right? First of all, I strongly agree with Mike, right? People are not complete idiots that just follow social narratives. Of course, to a certain extent we do. In a second, of course, to a certain extent we do, right? But this idea we get from prior proposition that whatever social pressure exists, people take it on and follow it uncritically, we think is a mischaracterization, is not true. But you disagree, Anna.
Please do note that this narrative that we're trying to force people into is not a benevolent one. It is a narrative in which they have to reproduce in order for society to view them as valuable, because we see parenthood as the ultimate good, right? They have to have tiny children and raise them. This is a narrative you're pushing people into.
Yes, but what part of this is not again, just having a narrative of pushing people into things that we generally think are good. And of course, there needs to be some, measurement in this. We shouldn't push people into having 10 kids, etc. But a little bit of a social pressure that having kids is maybe a good thing, as I'll explain my point later on. Is probably a good thing, right? And the last point, we had this idea of tiger parents, and look at how it justifies tiger parenting. The mere fact that we're talking about the concept of tiger parenting shows us that within our society, we have the ability to critically examine these processes and say tiger parenting is good. Who here has heard about tiger parenting in an extremely positive light? No, we talk about it as a problem, as something we need to solve, right? And this proves our point, that these things are separable from the concept of glorification of parenthood, that we as a society and that parents can go and look at Jesus, right? Chill, right? This is not what parenting looks like. And the concept of tiger parenting is all the proof we need that this idea of a social pressure in society existing does not mean that we go off the rails completely, off the cliff and into the abyss of parenthood with no limits. But more importantly, and the point that I want to make independently, is that I think for our demographic situation, the concept of a glorification of parenthood is very important. Now, I think before we start this point, we need to be very careful here, right? Because I think, and this is the exact point that I want to make, right? But toying around with demographics historically has been a really bad idea. Okay, and the point I'm not going to make the point that we're going to die out, you know, if people have less kids, etc. But I think it can be extremely damaging to our general demographic situation. Why? Because I think it's irrefutable, and side proposition will have to accept this, that we will have significantly fewer kids as a society if there is no glorification of parenthood. And we accept this on side of government. Right? We think it's good that we have this idea that, you know, parenting in itself is a value, something we should strive for. Of course, we need to help parents. We need to make sure that parents have, you know, enough resources to parent, etc. But ultimately, we think it's good that we kind of, you know, have a nudge towards parenting. Why? Because I think it's just generally how our society ensures that we have a stable population that, you know, keeps our society running. And, you know, that sounds like, you know, I'm toying with the concept of humanity, etc. But we have to understand how problematic for a society demographic like pitfalls are, right? Again, I'm not talking about, you know, humanity dying out, etc. But a good example of this is what happens to China with their like one-child policy. Right? What happens is a severe drop in population. Okay, and within this severe drop in population, what happens is you don't have social, like the fabric of society starts to unravel. Why? Because you have one person who has to care for 2 parents and 4 grandparents, 6 people in total. Right? Economically, that's not something we can handle. And why is the glorification of parenthood so important in this context? It's important because it ensures that having kids, that's number one, is a value and ensures that we as a society maintain a relatively stable population level, which, as you know, Machiavellian as it sounds, right, is fundamental and is fundamental to our economy. But second of all, and this is even more important, it ensures that we have kids no matter what kind of kids they are, right? It ensures that having kids in itself is a value, not having boys, right? Not having, you know, non-developmentally challenged kids, right? And this is the alternative that happens when people don't view parenthood in itself as a value, right? People start looking at other elements of parenthood and whether it's good or not. I'm being nudged by Nusha because I've gone over time. So these are the reasons why we strongly oppose the notion that the glorification of parenthood is bad and why we think we're in this debate.
Thank you very much, Ivan, for your speech, over the limit though it might be. Before we start with our final third speeches, I would very much kindly encourage you all to send in your questions because the question and answer part will follow this debate. But now let's hear first from the third speaker of Team Proposition to conclude their case. Here.
Start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Note the fact that the majority of our generation needs therapy was directly created by the glorification of parenthood. 4 points in my speech. Firstly, I'll talk about the rebuttal to Ivan's third argument. Secondly, I'll talk about how narratives actually work. And I'll talk about, firstly, how parents are likely to act and why worstly on their side of the house. And secondly, how the children are likely to be treated on their side of the house versus on our side of the house, right? But firstly, let's talk about rebuttal to Ivan's third argument about people not having children anymore. 3 points here. Firstly, we say that what Ivan is telling you is extremely unlikely and borderline apocalyptic, right? Because we say that people, even without the glorification of parenthood, are still extremely likely to have children. Why is it likely to happen? Firstly, because people just want a genetic mini-me, right? They want a miniature version of who they are, right? They want to have someone who looks like them and behaves like them. And secondly, people just want their genetic material to be reproduced, right? However, what we don't want is for those people to be pressured to have children by the narrative, right? We want that to be each individual's singular choice, right? And secondly, even if people have less children, that's fine. That's a narrative we're completely willing to accept, right? Because firstly, we say that this is extremely likely to mostly happen in the Western societies predominantly, right? This means that the only society that will ultimately die out is the Western society, which, like, firstly, they need to prove to us why Western society in and of itself is worth something that it's something that we should abstain and continue to have, because we see no inherent value in it. But secondly, we say that, like, the non-Western world, no, thank you, Ivan, non-Western world still has plenty of people to live through, right? But thirdly, we tell you, even if you buy none of the analysis I just showed you, we don't care, right? We don't care if people no longer have children. We don't care if people as a race die out because of this, because we say that what we value more is individuals' autonomy to have, or to not have children, right? The individual's autonomy to have the freedom of choice to have children or not. What we actually want, what our counterfactual is that instead of the narrative of why will you not have children being shown down your throat from the age of 5 up, we instead want the narrative of, oh, why do you want to have children as something that's accepted, right? Having children as something that is accepted as being weird and not one else, because we said this is exactly the time where people are comparatively more likely to be better parents and we're comparatively more likely to raise better children, right? This is the narrative we want to have. If our society has to die out for us to no longer force people into the idea of parenthood, to no longer force people to have small children, no, that are independently in charge of raising by themselves, that's completely fine by us. But secondly, in the second point of how the narratives work, right? Firstly, we said that please note that narrative as a concept is an academical concept, right? The people who are aware of the narratives are the people who are the most privileged in society, the people who have enough time in their day to be able to have academic discussions and sit down and think about how the society works and how do the things in society in general operate, right? These are extremely privileged people in our society, those who are able to be aware of the narrative, right? Secondly, we say that even if people are aware of the narrative, they're unlikely to be aware of the full extent of the narrative, right? That means that even if they are aware of the fact that society is forcing them to have children, they're not able to be aware of the fact on how big of an impact this has on who they are as people and how they change their individuality. No, because please do note that the narrative goes so deep that we are convinced from the point at which we're small children, about the fact that we're adults, we're forced into believing that we need to have children, that our ultimate way of happiness is to reproduce and have children. This is the only way how we'll reach happiness, right? This is how this narrative actually works, right? Later. But the reality of the narrative, and this is my third point, right? The reality of the narrative is that this is the narrative that forces you to not consider on do you actually want to have children or do not want to have children, but this is something that's fit to you as a person, but it's in fact something that you have to do because you're human and your job is to have siblings and to offer some grandchildren for your parents, right? This is how the narrative looks like, and they need to defend that narrative and not the narrative that they themselves show to you in their speeches. Before I move on to my last 2 points, I'll take Ivan.
So, Inea, any social narrative is bad, according to you. It doesn't matter what it leads to, as long as there's a social narrative, that's a bad thing.
This is a mischaracterization of our case, right? Exactly the point at which Ivan told you that this narrative is equal to other social narratives. We say that this narrative is in and of itself uniquely more harmful than the other narratives. This is not a social narrative where certain fashion is more important than the other. This is not a social narrative, this color is preferable than that color. This is a social narrative which offers you concrete harms. This is a social narrative that tells you that you need to raise a whole other person. Please do know that even intuitively, you understand the difference between having wearing a blue shirt or wearing recent fashion and the difference between having a small child, raising a person, being solely responsible for how another person is brought, right? Do not let Ivan fool you into thinking that this is the same as each and every other social narrative, right? But now moving on to my last 2 points. Firstly, how are parents likely to be worse and how they're likely to act? And secondly, how children are likely to be worse, how they're likely to act. Firstly, on the parents, right? We said that parents under our narrative are pressured into parenthood. To a certain degree, opposition concedes to that, right? We say that parents are from the point at which their children raised up into the idea that they need to have children, they need to offer offspring to their grandparents, etc., right? And how is this likely to manifest? It's firstly, we said that this is likely to manifest in the fact that when they actually have a child, they're not prepared for them because they were told that parenthood is something great, it's something brilliant, it's your ultimate goal as a person to have a child, to have a genetic offspring. But in fact, when they actually do have a child, they realize that it's not all sunshines and daisies, right? Having a child is hard. Firstly, childbirth is a very hard thing, and raising a child is also really hard because they have their own needs and demands as a person. They have their own specific things they want to do that may not align with the things you as a person want to do, right? And ultimately, it will end up being hard. The narrative conveniently does not tell you that. The narrative tells you that having children is good, it's great, it's easy, but it's not. And when the narrative will not prepare you for that, you will end up being, when you realize that it's actually hard, you'll end up being miserable because of the narrative, right? You end up thinking that either you did something wrong as a parent, or simply that I now did what I was supposed to do as a human being, and it did not turn out fine. I'm not happy. I'm not fulfilled, right? And ultimately, you will end up miserable either way, right? Either because you'll feel like a bad parent, or because you'll simply feel like the thing that's supposed to fulfill you according to the societal narrative does not actually fulfill you, right? And secondly, we tell you that it is likely to lead to parents not being prepared. Because note that the narrative that we have on our side of the house is the narrative that makes you question whether you want to have children or not. In that narrative, you are prepared because you question yourself and you wonder, and you are prepared to actually have children and raise them fully, thereby you're likelier to be a better parent. And this is also in similar way in how it affects children, right? You're likely to be a better parent to those children, ergo those children are not likely to have trauma that it would have had otherwise, right? And because of all of that, because we believe that in our side of the house, we have better individuals who do not decide on whether they want to have children or not on the basis of narrative, but on the basis of their own individual choice that they as human make. And because on our side of the house, we believe that the childhood of the people is on the net better, we beg you vote proposition.
Thank you very much, Agnea, for your speech. And now I invite Isa to present the last speech of our debate. Here.
All right, so I feel like it would be a good idea to start this case with some sort of a reality check for the side of proposition, right? Firstly, what they talk about in this case is like extreme cases of, A, traumatized children because they were too pressured, B, tiger moms, which again, as Ivan explained, are not generally the norm. Otherwise, we wouldn't have a special term for them, but they would just be mom. And this idea that, most people are this extremely unhappy having kids and they're extremely pressured. So my first point here is we have to analyze the narrative. And I think we brought this up quite often. But firstly, what is the narrative we're talking about? What is the social narrative, right? That parenthood is glorified, that being a parent is, hard, that it is difficult, and that having kids does have, that you have to be a good parent. That's sort of glorified. And I think that's good, right? But what happened in this debate is this idea that, in the first speech, they were talking about how this pressure of parenthood, just makes people go like, well, I don't care anymore. I'm a bad mom, and then therefore produce, and have this extreme pressure on themselves, right? And we think, you know what? Yes, it's good to have pressure on parents because it is hard to make a decent child, right? We need to have pressure for your parents to take you to ballet class, to take you to school, to maybe wake you up and give you breakfast. We don't see that necessarily as a bad thing, right? Because we understand as individuals, I hope, that it isn't extremely easy to just plop out a child. And we believe that this glorification actually puts pressure on parents to do better, right? So what happened here is this idea, this sort of how this narrative works, I think, which we need to sort of figure out. I feel like, yes, of course, it is a philosophical, a bit of a, not completely clear point in this debate, but what is a narrative? It's a social narrative, for instance, that, going to school is a good thing, right? That doesn't necessarily mean absolutely everyone does it. That doesn't necessarily mean you're pressured with a gun to go to college, right? And this is the same with parenthood, right? The way the side proposition was basically talking about it was like, you are forced with a gun to have kids and, reproduce. And we just don't think that's how narratives in general work, right? And also this idea, that came on later that, because of this social pressure, you are no longer a thinking human being who is like, I'm going to make this choice, right? Because realistically, let's look around. People aren't just having 7 kids because they're pressured into it. In general society in modern day, people have 2 kids because they realize, because of the pressure and glorification of parents, they understand that they have to be good parents, which means they have to have a secure job, a secure apartment. That's why we actually have, maybe 2 kids. People, work within their means. We see this narrative also, shifting through the times, right? It used to be the narrative that one couldn't be a good single parent. And we also see that has also changed, right? We think this narrative is just, yes, it puts pressure on parents, but we think, yeah, thank God it puts pressure on parents because maybe they wouldn't be good parents if we didn't have this pressure, right? And we believe that that's actually a justified thing. And in this debate, we have to talk about it, right? And I would think, again, let's stress this again very clearly. Narrative does not mean a gun to your head. It means a general belief which we think is justified, right? We don't think this is, you know, making parents hate their kids because they can't cope, or we don't think all of our moms were like, God damn it, I shouldn't have had that kid because I could have done so much more with my life, right? We see in the general society, people actually enjoy being parents and trying to be good parents, yes, because of the glorification. But what they were characterizing is a world that simply doesn't exist. And in this debate today, we have to talk about the world which we live in. You know, we all have parents. They don't all hate us because of a weird narrative that force them into having us, right? Okay, so second thing I think we need to talk about is parents, right? And it's very unclear of what, you know, side proposition actually thinks happens to parents, right? On the first page, you're talking about this sort of pressure, you know, and how parents are just gonna, you know, not be, you know, able to cope. And, you know, you have this sort of rebellion with like, you know, bad mom and wine mom and whatever. And this sort of produces, you know, for some, and also this pressure, you know, having extra expectations for your kids, which isn't exactly connected to the glorification of parenthood, right? That might be connected to, you know, other cultural factors, right? The glorification of parenthood simply means that you know, you have to be a good parent, that parenthood is hard and seen in society as something valuable, right? Not necessarily exactly what happens to the kids, right? So second, two things they say in the like debate that happens to the kids. A, they're going to become, you know, nervous wrecks because they just can't cope with societal pressure their parents put on them. And that's completely irrelevant. I mean, I don't think glorification of parenthood, you know, has that effect, right? Because what they're talking about is tiger parenting and this extreme pressure on children, which often happens in, you know, one child families or parents with different sort of means. Either way, we have glorification of parenthood also in European societies where we don't necessarily see kids, you know, crumbling under the pressure of their parents' expectations. If I speak from my own experience, my parents expected me to do nothing and I'm doing my best. But what I'm trying to say is that we know we still have to look at reality. We don't think this necessarily happens because of glorification of parenthood, right? And this other thing, like kids are just going to, because of this overindulgence in children, you know, over spoiling them or helicopter parenting them, they're going to become narcissists. And again, really, do we see this severely happening? And are we sure this is specifically the parent? Yes, we have a thing that happens currently that is called helicopter parenting or overindulging your kids, but we don't necessarily see that as clearly connected to the glorification of parenthood, right? Because these parents who do helicopter parent are being criticized by other parents, right? We have a new movement, for instance, you know, supporting, you know, kids going outside, supporting them being self-sufficient, right? We have lots of narratives, which is defining what is a good parent. And we still have this altering pressure. So we, again, don't see this, right? But second, I think thirdly, what we have to talk about, and I think this is the most important thing of this debate, even if, you know, some parents aren't going to be as happy if we had no pressure to be a good parent, we still have to look at the kids, right? Because I think in this debate, this is what it really comes down to. I think when we have a social pressure and a social, you know, narrative that, you know, says you're good people for having kids and there is a certain pressure and there's no thank you. And there is a certain pressure and there's a certain expectation for what it is for you to be a good parent. And in society, that is accepted as, you know, a very important part. We think that just in general, kids have a much better life, right? Because they are protected, because parents have a certain pressure on them to do what they have to take your kids to the debate practice that you think is going to be pointless or the, you know, extracurricular activities. That pressure is good because that actually gives kids a good childhood. And we think also with this societal narrative, we also have better outcomes for people being good parents, being able to be good parents, right? People will always give up their seat for a pregnant woman, right? We have maternity leave, we have paternity leave, because we as a society understand that for us, it is important that we have kids and it is hard to have kids. And it is better for kids and it's better for parents that in society, this narrative exists where we value their effort and we put pressure on their effort because we want good children. And we think with our side, we actually achieve that. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Isa, for your Isa. Thank you very much, Isa, for your speech, and thank you very much all the debaters who participated in this debate. Now it's time for you guys and your questions. Okay, so again, send them over to me. We had you can ask either all the debaters as a collective, or you can target your questions specifically to whichever debater you would prefer them to answer. We had one general question on the origin of tiger parents. Are they the side product or the opposition of the narrative? So basically, how do tiger parents work in this concept? Debaters, who wants to take this one?
Sorry, can I repeat it? Cons
Okay, so are tiger parents the side product or the opposition of the narrative?
Okay, so obviously what we try to argue in this debate is that they're either the latter, so the opposition of the narrative of parenting in itself being a beneficial thing, right? Because if you do think about it, in a way, tiger parenting is the opposition of glorification of parenthood, right? Because it's not enough that you're a parent, right? It's not, you know, the fact that you're a parent and that the kids are happy is not enough, right? Parenting in tiger parenting is simply a means to an end of success, either your child or the parent himself, probably by proxy more often than the child himself. So I think we would argue that it is the latter, or if it's not the latter, at least it's an anomaly. An anomaly that happens, you know, any social mechanism is going to have, you know, outliers that are negative, right? But I don't remember what's the legal term. It's like in Latin, with like abuse does not justify use. Anyway, so just because something has, you know, certain abusive cases, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad on its own. And what I try to argue in my speech is exactly the question then is the benefit that it brings, does that outweigh these negative examples? And I would argue that it does. Ednaya would probably disagree.
I think that what our side ultimately try to argue is the opposite narrative, right? Where tiger parents are harmfully so the obvious consequence of this narrative, right? Because the narrative tells you that you as a person will be fulfilled at a point at which you are a parent. Thereby, all the things that you did not fulfill in your life or all your dreams that ultimately fell short, that you projected that upon your offspring, right? You projected that idea. And that's why the tiger parents are who they are ultimately, because they project themselves onto their children, how they're supposed to act. And they parent so closely just because they understand children as the firstly, like the logical consequence of themselves, but secondly, also as the main product, the main thing they'll produce in their life, and thereby they're likely to tiger parent, right? So on the side of proposition, we sort of believe that they are the logical consequence of the glorification of parenthood as a whole.
Okay, anyone else to add anything about tiger parents? Okay. So without glorification, parents would have it even worse. No maternity leave, for example. Struggle more, and therefore there would be even less children in the world. Debaters as a group, agree or disagree?
I mean, to a certain degree, like, sure. I think that to a certain degree, the second part is true, right? Where there would be less children in the world as a whole. I as a person, agree with, I think that as a person, I do not agree with that purely because of the fact that I think that there are still ultimately selfish reasons why parents have children that are completely independent of the glorification narrative. But ultimately, as a debater on the side of proposition, I would have to argue that that is not true. And as I said in my speech, there are still other reasons why people have children, like as a sort of genetical offsprings of themselves, the mini-me they have, whatever, right? And I think that maternity leave in and of itself is also not a consequence of people having children and us glorifying parents, but is in fact like a consequence of the fact that we as a society have fought for that, right? In quite a similar way than, for example, an 8-hour workday is a consequence of a lot of workers fighting for that right. Then also maternity leave is a consequence of certain workers fighting for the right to have that, and not a glorification of parenthood. It's simply a matter of how much do we appreciate people who are parents, not how much we appreciate like parenthood as a concept.
Okay, Ivan?
I think I think that's a very good question. And I think it's a very good question because I think it points to something that's very important in this debate from what I also used in my speech is concept of meta debate, right? So a question not within the content, that's the word, within the content of the debate, but rather the question of how the debate itself is proceeding, right? And I think what this question really points out is that I think neither side really, we didn't do a good job of it, and Prop also not, is also is ultimately explain why it matters what we are saying, right? So okay, we had this whole explanation about how, you know, it's great that parents have, you know, that we have more kids, and Prab has this whole explanation of, you know, how it doesn't matter, etc. But I don't think we do a good job of tying this back to the motion and ask ourselves, so because we'll have less kids or because we'll have more kids, do we care about this or not? Right? Do we want more kids? Do we want less kids? Does it matter to us that we have fewer or more kids? And I think that's something that I think why I would strongly encourage all of you to join the debate club and do lots of debate, is because debate is very good at punishing you for doing this. I think especially within the educational system, all of us get, I think, taught this concept that, you know, just say something, you know, like just have an opinion and that's good enough. And I think in debate, what debate teaches us is to tell you, you know, no, like, okay, have an opinion, be correct, but also tell me why it matters. Why is it relevant? And so the answer to this question really is not whether we have more kids or not. I think both sides in this debate agree that we'll probably have fewer kids if we don't glorify parenthood. What we should have talked more about probably is whether this matters or whether we should care.
And I would like to add here that I think Yernea kind of responded to this kind of a preposition that even made, right, that this is a good thing, that there's a lot of children and that we should procreate and stuff like that. And she said, okay, but she traded it off, right, the Western civilization for this value of having the free choice of being a parent. But I think it's a completely legitimate question to ask, like, should people continue with their civilization? Like, is living a value enough to trade it off for a bad life, right? So if there are like legitimate harms that come from a bad type of parenting, is living badly maybe even worse than just like slowly stopping the civilization? So yeah, I think that's a good question. I just wanted to point that out.
Okay, thank you very much. Anyone else, anything? No? Okay, then next question. If we look at a heterosexual couple with children, is the mother the one who is glorified more, or is it the father glorified more? And debaters, if you want to maybe comment on the dimension of how is this perceived in both developed countries, because I think we focus mostly on developed countries. If you now want to shine a light on developing countries, maybe a bit more. Ivan, I see your hand.
I just want So I want to preface this question because I think this is a very fascinating topic, and I spent a lot of time like reading about it and watching like videos and stuff. Relevant. And that is before we even start answering this question, I think there's been a massive shift in how the world looks like in the last 30 or 40 years, and I don't think we have caught up with this shift. And I'm not sure, I don't remember by heart what the exact number is, but I right now, I think we're looking at like 70% of the world being on 2 children, right? This concept of us having like this massive, you know, third world that has like 7 children per family really doesn't exist anymore, right? You have all of China, a majority of India, right? A majority of Africa that is, when it comes to demographics, catching up or like adopting the trend of a 2-kid family, plus minus, right? I don't want to make a value judgment whether this is good or bad here, but I think it's important to kind of preface these questions is that we have to realize that the demographics of the world have rapidly changed in the last 20 years. And the projections are that we'll never actually reach 9.5 billion, right? That like this, you know, oh, the population growth, right? We're going to overrun the planet. If you look at the math of it, is not really happening.
Okay, but also to the first point of the question, I do think we should have perhaps talked about, you know, the gender dichotomy here a bit more. Glorified more or less is a hard question. I think to some extent, yes, women are glorified more, but that also means to some extent they are pressured more, right? So the whole concept of parenthood is an iffy one, right? In this debate, we try to focus on really parenthood, just the concept of reproduction. Of course, on the ground, that does have sort of I don't know how to explain it. Of course, it is a gender equal playing field. I think we all understood that. And I think to some extent that's why I think this debate is hard. Should have had more nuance in this. I do think women are pressured more, obviously, but I also think that we have to, to some extent, look at, differences also on Western society and other societies. We do think this idea of parenthood is sort of encompassing more and having a different, sort of look. Men are, also to some extent, praised for being deeply involved in their child's life, and many things have changed since the 50s. And also, I feel like we also have to, look at different cultural things here as well. I feel like, yes, and perhaps very traditional Christian or very, Catholic sort of denominations, and, Mormons maybe, a lot of cultural specificity goes into who has the pressure of raising a child.
Yeah, definitely.
And I think in this debate, we would have caught ourselves in a trap and really talked about a lot of things without any specificity. So when we're talking about parenthood, I thought what we did was a bit better because we kind of stepped away from it and said, okay, let's talk about parenthood as a whole and try not to, get caught in a million different sort of specificities.
It's just a question that it's so varied that it's really hard to encompass in one bit. Okay,
Mai and Thea?
Yeah, okay. My opinion is that they are just glorified differently because, like Mother as saints, it is expected from them to sacrifice their whole life for the child. Meanwhile, when a father does something, everyone applauds him. Like a father will cook a lunch and it was great. You're an amazing father. We love you, king behavior. But it really isn't. It's just bare minimum.
Yeah, I actually wanted to point that out as well. I think that being an involved father today is glorified more simply because it's perceived as more of an oddity for a father to, I don't know, change a diaper, right? So the standards are lower, and thus it's much easier to be applauded for doing something in the Western society, of course, in this specific case. However, I do also think that glorification as such is not always, once the glorification settles in, it's not a reward anymore, right? It's more of a cage, because at some point it stops being something that you're applauded for. It starts being something that's expected. And that's what has happened throughout history with the women's role in their families. And yeah, that's why I think that, I love the topic. I wish we had talked about it more, but yeah, I agree that it's messy once you get to it.
Ivan?
I 100% agree with this take. I think it's not just parenting where this happens, where the bare minimum from men is considered, wow, crazy.
As a man.
But yeah, it's true. But I think a counter argument to this is that in a way, doesn't this show that we're trying to push society in a different direction, right? It's because we want men to take on a bigger role within parenting that we overcompensate, and it's if we're trying to maintain this concept of just women being part of parenthood, right, then we wouldn't have this over rewarding of men for doing parental things. So please, I'm not saying this is necessarily justified, but I'm just saying that I think this could be understood as a sign that the direction that society is going is toward removing these traditional gender roles from parenting.
Okay, and now we have one more question, and after that, I think we will wrap up. But I think this question is an important one. Debaters, I think it was slightly unclear because you guys just started talking about a narrative. Now I would like for you to clarify what that narrative is. Is it that people need to become parents to be fulfilled as people, or that parents need to dedicate 200% of their time to their child, or something else completely?
I think it's both. I mean, narrative is not one, it's not one fixed sentence or an idea. It's mostly something that's regulated on the level of the society, with just, non-formal judgment from other people. So we're basically controlling each other in that sense. And I think that glorification of parenthood manifests in all of those ways, right? So on one hand, it's, yeah, sure, you should be a parent, and we're gonna judge you if you don't plan on that being the height, the climax of your life. But secondly, it's also, once you're at that point, right, well, why aren't you awesome at it? So I think it's all of that, actually. Yeah.
Okay. So Ruthie?
Oh,
Fireworks.
There's fireworks.
No one. Okay. I think, yeah, it is a general and broad thing. And I think the characterization Nika gives to some extent is, I think a narrative is generally how we think about a certain topic, right? So we glorify parents, yes, in the sense that, as she said, you should be a parent, and also the pressure we put on to, being a parent on the ground, right? Getting your kids to that weird instrument lesson they have thought up. And I think it is kind of the way people talk about it. What is the ideas surrounding it, right? When someone has a kid, when you see a pregnant woman, congratulations, right? You don't say, oh my God, what happened?
Is a might.
I probably would. But anyway, I think it's just the way in general society talks about it and the value judgments that you have it. Ivan, you may speak further.
Okay. So I think this question actually hides one of the biggest problems with social narratives. And that's that the narrative, it's very difficult for the narrative to be nuanced. Okay. The narrative is all nuanced. So it's always going to be broad. It's always going to be simplistic, and it will almost always include elements that just do not apply to the specific situation of that individual. And this is a problem with narratives. And the problem is that the narrative will not care. It will be there, and like a bulldozer, it will, try to enforce one form of like habit or behavior on the whole of society. And the problem is that the question is like, it's both of those things. And at the same time, both of those things can be problematic for certain people. And I think this is the core issue of this debate, is that we have to then ask ourselves, are some of the benefits that we get from this narrative worth the fact that undoubtedly some people in society will be bulldozed by this narrative, and their specific individual situation will be ignored, and they'll be worse off because of it.
Okay, I think this would probably be it from our side. If you guys have any further questions, like when you're preparing for your exams and such, feel free to message us. If you have debate-specific questions that you think were not answered in this discussion, you can ask your professors, and they will either reach out to me, and our debaters volunteer to come to your classes to explain further. But if we don't match up our schedules, then we'll just answer by proxy. I think what we learned from this debate is that debaters generally should not be parents. And thank you all for coming. I think Megan now has some parting words for us as well.
Yeah, sure. Of course, first off, I would like to thank you, debaters, and Nusha, of course, on behalf of the department, for being willing to, sacrifice or donate your time and to be willing to go into prep debates and all the, there's a lot of effort invested in it. But as is usually the case, debates have a life of their own, and they part ways with some pre-planning very often. This is also the charm of it, I guess. So thank you for all the material that you put on the table. I'm sure that we can, that you can, everybody can benefit from this one way or another. Even if you do not like certain things, or even if you do not like the way something turned out to be, that's proper food for thought. And I am really looking forward to your response in class. And what matters is what happens within your families, among your friends, you know, in your heads, in your hearts, and what happens in class later on as well. So thanks once again, really, and thank you for being a wonderful audience. And I think this is about it. We can wrap it up, and I wish you a lovely remainder of the evening.